As 1992 drew to a close, senior figures at Square were incredibly satisfied. Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team had done it again. Final Fantasy V had been a huge success, with almost every metric, both critical and commercial, surpassing what had been achieved by Final Fantasy IV. And not only that, they had been able to close the gap on Dragon Quest in a meaningful way. Final Fantasy was no longer playing catch-up, they were now a legitimate rival and contemporary. There was no time to rest on their laurels, however. Sakaguchi knew that if Square were to continue to maintain and then grow their market share, they needed to ensure a quick turnaround time on their next project. But beyond that, he also knew that whatever they brought to market needed to be even bigger and better than anything they had produced before. There were just a few challenges. First, there was a sense that the two major objectives may contradict each other, as rushing to get the next installment out may lead to a diminishment in quality. Second, due to the continued success of Final Fantasy, Sakaguchi's role within the company was required to change. But failure was not an option. Final Fantasy had to succeed, no matter what. This mantra emboldened the existing staff to go again, with any new staff who joined the team quickly coming to realise the standards that were expected if they were going to survive in this environment. Everything was fast-paced and frenetic, but when all these aspects combined, they led to the creation of Final Fantasy VI, an experience that ended up being life-changing for those involved in its creation and those who played it. By the end of 1992, Final Fantasy V sat as the fourth best-selling game released so far on the Super Famicom. It was only behind Super Mario World, Dragon Quest V, and Super Mario Kart, and had managed to supplant another stalwart in Street Fighter II. Such performance showed the power of the Final Fantasy brand, but it also highlighted the extreme competition they faced. Super Mario World and Super Mario Kart were first-party titles that had no close contemporaries on the platform. Indeed, Sonic the Hedgehog had emerged as Mario's main competitor, but that particular rivalry was born from hardware manufacturers themselves wanting to duke it out, and in Japan at least, it wasn't even really a rivalry at all. Street Fighter II was in a similar situation, serving as a trailblazer for the burgeoning fighting scene on consoles. Fatal Fury launched soon after, but its impact was minimal by comparison, only selling 50,000 copies in its first week on sale. It meant the Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy franchises existed in a unique situation, as they both resided in the exact same genre, and they were both capable of selling millions of copies. This meant there was a very realistic possibility that one brand was able to steal market share from the other. And from the outside, it looked as though this was already starting to happen. Dragon Quest had been the undoubted king of role-playing games during the Famicom era. Even though other franchises were popular on personal computers, such as Ultima and Wizardry, the brilliance of Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura helped to define the genre to a new audience, and other creators such as Hironobu Sakaguchi, Koji Okada, Kotaro Hayashida, Masayoshi Hashimoto, and Keisuke Terasaki were all playing catch-up and attempting to forge their own path. Out of this collection, however, Final Fantasy was the only entry to see the same kind of growth as Dragon Quest, and the decision by Yuji Horii to spend so long developing Dragon Quest V had only strengthened the position of Final Fantasy. Whereas the first 3 Dragon Quest games came out at a rapid pace, with 3 games releasing in less than 2 years that collectively sold 7.7 million copies, Dragon Quest IV had taken longer to develop than those 3 games combined, and its sales, when it did launch, were lower than Dragon Quest III. Dragon Quest V then took even longer to develop, and by the middle of 1993, its sales had only just passed those of Dragon Quest II. Despite there still being huge intrigue around the franchise, it became clear to Horii that something wasn't working, and that something was the speed at which they worked in comparison to the team at Square. Hori even noted in an interview alongside Sakaguchi that he couldn't believe how Square managed to pump out Final Fantasy games so quickly without there being any kind of drop in quality. Speed, however, was a huge advantage, and Sakaguchi knew this. They needed to ensure they kept the focus and attention of consumers on their franchise, not their competitors, and he created the internal goal of ensuring a brand new Final Fantasy game released every single year, no matter the cost. It seemed far-fetched given how complicated development was becoming, but Sakaguchi believed they could achieve this goal with the right balance, and the results were there, clear as day. Final Fantasy III launched right after Dragon Quest IV, and Final Fantasy V launched right after Dragon Quest V. Square had therefore managed to release an entire entry that Dragon Quest had no answer for, despite also cancelling another iteration entirely, and by mid-1993, the collective sales of Final Fantasy IV and V had surpassed what Enix had achieved with their first iteration on the Super Famicom. Not only that, but whereas Dragon Quest V saw its sales shrink in comparison to its predecessor, Final Fantasy V saw its sales grow. This created a very tense atmosphere between the two companies, but Kazuhiko Torishima, the influential media mogul who had lectured Sakaguchi after the release of Final Fantasy III and had a pre-existing close relationship with Hori, served as something of a mediator. He encouraged Sakaguchi and Hori to meet, and they developed a cordial relationship. But neither Sakaguchi or Hori was ever willing to talk too much about what they had in the pipeline, lest it give the other a competitive advantage. Indeed, the pair confessed to religiously playing each other's new releases to see what innovations were present, as neither wanted to be accused of plagiarism or being a cheap imitation. And if there was something that they felt was too derivative, the two tour de forces would then go back to their teams and demand that they modify that particular aspect, whether it be related to a specific character, a plot device, or even a gameplay system, as they wanted to ensure there could be no accusations, but also because they wanted their game to be superior. The external rivalry between Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy created some healthy competition, helping to push the genre to new heights. But Square was also keen to create internal competition too, as they sought to turn their company from its humble beginnings as a small publisher of games on personal computers into a publishing juggernaut that could rival some of the biggest players that were based in Japan. Pre-Final Fantasy, Square had created 4 separate development divisions that worked on independent projects, but after the success of Final Fantasy, most of those divisions were dissolved, and primary focus was placed around ensuring Final Fantasy II surpassed its predecessor. After this objective was accomplished, Square started to branch out again, with Saga finding its footing and Mana following soon after. The success of Romancing Saga then cemented that this was the correct approach, but as the company grew, so too did their approach to development. For the longest time, even when teams were separate, there was a strong notion of shared learning and resource management. It wasn't uncommon for individuals to contribute to multiple games at the same time, irrespective of which team was overseeing development. If certain individuals had skills that were needed to complete a specific task, they were just loaned out for a short period or shifted teams entirely until the project was complete. This approach was even present during the development of Final Fantasy IV, as numerous individuals were expected to work concurrently on the next iteration of Final Fantasy for the Famicom and Super Famicom, while also supporting other projects such as Rad Racer 2. But after the completion of Final Fantasy IV, everything started to change. Sakaguchi appreciated that to ensure a quick turnaround time, the core spine of his team needed to remain intact, so as to avoid everything they'd learnt being lost. This spine could then be supplemented by individuals from other teams who either showed immense talent or just wanted a change, but the core bulk of the new acquisitions came from fresh hires as opposed to internal moves. But Sakaguchi was not the only person who felt this way, and this led to a near-complete delineation of development within Square, which was facilitated by the establishment of clear and defined development departments that could work concurrently with one another, but also independently. But there wasn't just 1 or 2 teams codified based on existing workflows and projects, there were 6. As the longest standing development team and the shining light of the company, the team working on Final Fantasy, which was helmed by Sakaguchi, was called Development Team 1. Development Team 2 was then helmed by Akitoshi Kawazu, with their focus being the further expansion of the Romancing Saga franchise. Development Team 3 was then overseen by Hiromichi Tanaka, a stalwart of the company, who was joined by Koichi Ishii and Nasir Jebeli. They were tasked with expanding the Mana franchise. Development Team 4 was helmed by Kazuhiko Aoki, who had been a free spirit for many years. Aoki had assisted with Final Fantasy 3 and 4, but had also proven his leadership skills by creating the Hanjaku Hero franchise, and he was tasked with expanding that particular franchise before then being given the responsibility of starting provisional work on Chrono Trigger. Development Team 5 was then created by Takashi Tokita after he finished up work assisting with the creation of that new Hanjaku Hero game. Due to his efforts up until now, which culminated with Tokita being the principal designer and scenario writer on Final Fantasy IV, he was then given license to create a brand new IP which became Live Alive. The sixth and final development team was then helmed by Chihiro Fujioka, who had overseen Saga 3 and Mystic Quest. As perhaps a way of saying thank you for everything they'd done on those two games with almost no support from the rest of the company, Fujioka was given permission to create a brand new strategy RPG. But after struggling to make progress, the team ended up being dissolved to help with the production of Live Alive. Needless to say, there was suddenly a lot going on at Square. No longer were they working on 1 or 2 games per year, they were working on up to 6 that then had to be carefully coordinated by upper management and marketing to ensure there was no oversaturation. And that extra layer was crucial, as each of the development departments started to operate effectively as mini companies, with their own dedicated resources and profit and loss margins. In short, silos started to form. Development Team 1, however, was very much still the main focus, and despite the divisions being created, ensuring Final Fantasy delivered was still of paramount importance to the company. Sakaguchi therefore ensured that those who stayed in the team were the best of the best at Square. But if, for whatever reason, anyone wanted to leave, due to the new structure, they were still able to forge their own paths within other teams. Hiromi Ito, Akihiko Mitsui, and Hiroshi Takai, for example, left Development Team 1 to join Development Team 2. And Katsuhisa Higuchi and Masanori Hoshino joined Development Team 4, where they helped Aoki navigate the early stages of development on Chrono Trigger. The other notable mover was Yasunori Mitsuda, who, after becoming frustrated with Uematsu's position as the premium composer at the company, left Development Team 1 due to a lack of available opportunities, something which also ended up rewarding him with the main gig on Chrono Trigger. These elements created something of a perfect storm at Square though, specifically within Development Team 1. They had accrued some of the most talented individuals from across the company, many of whom had now worked on 3 or 4 of the previous 5 Final Fantasy games. But with Dragon Quest V releasing just before Final Fantasy V, and with the sales being more comparable than they ever had been before, the rivalry started to become even more intense, and it started something akin to an arms race to see who could release their next installment first and what innovations they may bring to the table. But even though they should have been set up perfectly, an unfortunate byproduct of Sakaguchi's success threatened to undermine everything they had built so far. Final Fantasy had been fundamental to the success of Square, and although other IPs had been created that helped to bolster their sources of revenue, it was still very much their premium property. Many individuals had contributed to this, and Final Fantasy was very much the sum of its parts. But as the team leader, the role of Sakaguchi could not be understated. He injected creativity when it was required, had expert man management, and also pushed his teams to dream big. And hit tough deadlines. Sakaguchi's position as the head of Development Team 1 was in recognition of these feats, but there also became a sense within the senior management team that Sakaguchi deserved more, and after the release of Final Fantasy IV, he was promoted to the position of Executive Vice President. In the initial sense, this position did not impact his work much, and Sakaguchi was still very hands-on with Final Fantasy V as he had been with every previous game, perhaps even more so with regards to the scenario. But after the release of that game, things started to change. Sakaguchi was tasked with thinking holistically about the future of the Final Fantasy franchise and how it might develop, but he was also tasked with doing the same for many other properties that were being developed around the same time, including Saga, Mana, and the fledgling Chrono Trigger. This placed a clear strain on his connection and commitment to Development Team 1, and it was somewhat at odds with where Final Fantasy needed to be and where they needed to get to. After all, without their fearless leader, how on earth could they hope to raise the bar yet again and continue to close the gap to Dragon Quest? Prior to the release of Final Fantasy V, there was a sense that the team had developed something special. Feedback was good from playtesting, and when they showed it off at trade shows, the game scored well relative to its competition. But the critical and commercial success of the game when it launched, with many of the junior staff thinking that it was unreal to have worked on a game that was so impactful. In the short term, there was a real sense of elation over what had been accomplished. But once the dust had settled and Sakaguchi laid out provisional plans and release windows for the next installment in the franchise, the mood started to shift. This process was nothing new, of course. Many of the other senior figures had worked on numerous iterations of the Final Fantasy franchise. But for those who weren't quite so seasoned, the pressure of attempting to surpass a game of the stature of Final Fantasy V ended up being quite daunting from the outset. And this was because the internal objectives had shifted. As instead of having the objective of Final Fantasy V just surpassing Final Fantasy IV, they were attempting to surpass all other role-playing games. Period. With the reception being so solid, however, there was a sense that even though Dragon Quest V had sold more copies, the objective had still been accomplished. In their mind, and indeed the minds of many others across Japan, Final Fantasy V was a superior role-playing game. This meant that new objectives had to be found. So alongside creating a game that could surpass Final Fantasy V and surpass all other past, present, and hopefully future role-playing games, the team also vowed to make Final Fantasy VI a standout candidate in every area relating to design, gameplay, and presentation. Sakaguchi even told the sound team that they needed to up their game so they could surpass Konami, who were the market leaders in that particular area. They were no longer content with what they had accomplished, and the overriding sentiment going into the development of Final Fantasy VI was that by its conclusion, it needed to be seen as a candidate for being one of the best video games ever made. The fulcrum of this activity was, of course, the team. With Development Team 1 now very much a sustained entity, Sakaguchi was able to employ the same tactics he had for the production of Final Fantasy V. The only major difference was that the spine of the team was now more experienced and larger, and this meant there was more scope to bring in fresh, new blood who were ambitious and eager to prove themselves. The spine consisted of the likes of Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito, who had proven themselves more than capable on Final Fantasy V, but Ken Narita and Kiyoshi Yoshi returned as the game's main programmers. Nobuo Uematsu was there as the main composer, and there were a slew of artists who had impressed and been given promotions as a reward for their fine work and general aptitude. This saw the likes of Tetsuya Takahashi, Tetsuya Nomura, and Hideo Minaba promoted to the role of director alongside Kazuko Shibuya. The new hires, and there were plenty of them, then felt a high degree of prestige having been selected to work on a Final Fantasy game, but they were also aware of the intense pressure they were going to be forced to endure. And this didn't just relate to the pressure to succeed, but also the pressure to keep up with and deliver high work that was befitting a project of this nature, while also being expected to maintain an incredible work ethic throughout the game's entire production run. With this kind of project, there was no room for passengers, and there was an expectation that anyone who was selected to be part of Development Team 1 would be willing to step up to the plate and deliver every single day. The reality was that they had been picked to work on the next iteration in one of the most prestigious Japanese video gaming franchises. And for those who were joining Square, having never worked in the video games industry before, this was a huge deal, especially as many of them were assigned to work on the game's narrative and its visuals, and those were two aspects the player would gain a lot of exposure to, and therefore would have plenty of opinions about. Eiji Nakamura, for example, who was a new hire on Final Fantasy VI, tasked with sampling sound effects and creating tones, later noted that one of the first things Sakaguchi ever said to him after joining the company was, "Don't ever let the quality of your work drop." Alongside the spine and new hires, a few people then moved around from other departments to work on Final Fantasy VI, mostly relating to event planning, sound design, and systems engineering. And this was a crucial component, as areas that had never received specific focus before were now given dedicated resources. Sound effects was one such area, In every prior game, they were created by people who just had spare time, often graphic designers who had finished their tasks and had no idea what they were doing. It wasn't until Final Fantasy VI that a dedicated individual was assigned the specific role of creating sound effects. Final Fantasy VI also saw much more focus placed around the story. In the previous game, the majority of the event sequences were made by Kitase and Sakaguchi, but this time a whole team was formed that included 5 people who then supported Kitase and Sakaguchi. All things considered, this meant the staff saw a significant increase in size, with around 40 people involved at some point throughout development, and this was a relatively large team compared to others who were working on games at the time. Outside of establishing the team, however, the biggest question still remained. What kind of game should Final Fantasy VI be? This was a question that was always asked at the beginning of each project, and the initial phase, which began towards the end of January 1993, revolved around people just putting forth their ideas, which was then used to form a general sense of direction that could be followed. There was a major difference this time around, however, compared to what they had previously done. Even though Sakaguchi was still the head of Development Team 1, his active role throughout development was required to change. There were just other challenges in the company that needed his particular skills, and one of them was overseeing the general development pipeline for almost the entire company. Fulfilling that task and managing what was akin to a medium-sized development studio, and also directing the next major iteration in one of the most anticipated games at that time, was just too much. So he made a difficult but very important decision, and that decision was to step down from directorial duties and instead become a producer. In this role, alongside the general ideation, Sakaguchi was able to provide a solid blueprint for what he wanted to see from Final Fantasy VI, before then delegating specific responsibilities out to the 2 individuals he trusted most. In truth, this was similar to the situation that was in place for Final Fantasy V, but it was now more formalized, as Kitase and Ito were promoted to the roles of co-director, and were given more autonomy as to how they accomplished the overriding objectives that were given to them by Sakaguchi, with Kitase effectively overseeing the drama side of development and Ito overseeing the battle. Sakaguchi's job as producer was then to ensure that these 2 aspects that Kitase and Ito were overseeing properly fused together to create a comprehensive and complete package. But with the change of leadership came a slight change of approach. Quite often, after the brainstorming phase was complete, the next stage was to pull together comprehensive documentation aligning all the major things they wanted to accomplish in the game, and this related not just to the narrative and its themes, but also how gameplay tied into everything. Kitase and Ito felt there were merits to this approach, but they chose to document far less, and the typical master document was never created to lead the way. They didn't want anything major to be set in stone at this point, and preferred to be much more adaptable to the whims of creativity as development commenced. And because of how young video games were as a medium, such a decision was crucial for allowing members of the team to flourish. Even though Final Fantasy was now moving into its 6th iteration, many of the original team who oversaw the creation of 1 through 3 had used the franchise as a stepping stone, before then going on to create their own franchises. Fortunately, such was the success of Final Fantasy III that a whole new wave of talent was brought into the company. But because of how young the video games industry was, the lines of seniority that would often be there in other industries due to age just weren't all that visible. Senior members of the team were still relatively young, and this was evidenced by Kitase, who, despite being one of the younger members of the team, was given one of the most senior positions. He was also only 4 years younger than Sakaguchi, who at the time was only 31, yet was still in charge of budgets that were starting to skyrocket. It was perhaps because the staff had evolved so much that they collectively chose to rebel against elements that were deemed to be foundational to the franchise. Ever since Final Fantasy II, the question of what defined a Final Fantasy game had continued to persist. But now, there were plenty of egos involved, and those egos could be bucketed into 3 groups. Those who had been part of the original crew that worked on Final Fantasy 1 through 3, those who were part of the 2nd generation of creators who had worked on Final Fantasy 4 and 5, and those who were just starting out and wanting to make a name for themselves. This could have caused mass conflict, as everyone had individual opinions about what a Final Fantasy should be. But instead, it led to a shared sentiment of wanting to try something new, as opposed to just wanting to copy what had been done before. They wanted to collectively challenge themselves. The first area that came into focus was the narrative connection with crystals and their emphasis on traditional sword and sorcery fantasy. The overriding sentiment was that this story device had been done to death, as crystals had been given a high degree of prominence in each of the 5 previous narratives, often being central to plot progression and in general serving as the main driving force behind the narrative. With their main competitor being praised so much for its narrative depth, it was felt that perhaps now was the time to explore something different, and this meant stepping away from crystals to see if they could tell an original type of story. This then facilitated a change of subgenre within the realm of fantasy. Previous games had always flirted with futuristic science fiction elements. The original Final Fantasy, for example, had the Flying Fortress, and Final Fantasy IV introduced the Lunar Whale alongside the ability to travel to and from the moon. This time, however, one of the team proposed the idea of creating something much more industrial. Aspects of this did evolve over time, as per Kitase and Ito's plans, but from the outset, this idea proposed that they try and figure out how to incorporate machinery into a fantasy world. The art directors were then a prominent driver of this, as they wanted to introduce more of their personal interests into the aesthetic of the game, but there was also a belief that the sword and sorcery aesthetic was holding the franchise back, and that with technology and hardware specifications now being much more advanced, and with the team being more experienced, they could really challenge themselves to create a world that incorporated so many different themes all into one. This theme of then leveraging their experience with the hardware then manifested onto the playable characters and their gameplay functions. Final Fantasy IV and V had taken very different approaches to party setup, with 4 opting for a large, more restricted party, and 5 opting for a smaller party with a ton of variety due to that small party having access to an incredible number of jobs. In the past, the developers had often cut corners to hit deadlines or compensate for low specifications, but they no longer felt that was a barrier. This time, they therefore wanted to go big or go home by creating an expanded cast that dwarfed Final Fantasy IV alongside an expanded array of customization that was even more comprehensive than Final Fantasy V. Everything pointed towards a massive undercurrent of change, but these ambitions didn't come cheap, and even though Final Fantasy V had served as a massive upgrade on Final Fantasy IV, jumping from an 8MB cartridge to a 16MB one, Final Fantasy VI upped the ante again by requiring a 24MB cartridge, and this came with a pretty steep financial commitment from Square to make this happen. Sakaguchi, however, was more than happy to make such an investment in his team. He was confident that they could deliver on those initial objectives, and by placing his faith in Kitase and Ito, he was excited to see how they would approach their leadership roles as he stepped away from being so involved in the day-to-day. Sakaguchi was still involved though. He'd always loved developing the narrative and had been directly or indirectly involved with establishing the premise and core themes of every previous game, even going so far as to write and adjust the script for some of them. Now in the role of producer, Sakaguchi again came up with the broad story premise, which, as they were moving away from having crystals be the driving force, was now going to revolve around what had often been a secondary narrative theme: rebels attempting to overcome evil Imperial forces. It sounded simple on paper, as most narratives do when broken down to their basic components, but Sakaguchi and Kitase vowed that this time their narrative was going to be far more sophisticated than anything previously associated with the franchise. Final Fantasy IV had served as a significant turning point in this regard. Having taken the feedback from Kazuhiko Torishima to heart, Sakaguchi sought to enhance the quality of the scenario, and this saw them create an expanded cast whose fates were interwoven with each other and the world around them. Final Fantasy V then followed a similar approach, except this time the number of protagonists was reduced so they could each have more development, with the scenario itself also having a lot more depth with the way it connected to the world. The sentiment of character-driven stories was becoming more and more pronounced, and other development teams were even taking a similar approach, with Takashi Tokita, who had planned out the scenario of Final Fantasy IV, opting to take the notion even further when developing Live Alive, which happened concurrently and in isolation from Final Fantasy VI. In short, within Square as a whole, there was a want to transform characters from simply being vessels that were used to progress the overarching story. Instead, they wanted them to be seen as characters of substance, each with their own backstories that could be used to evoke different sets of emotions amongst the player base. and this was a huge point of differentiation. As those steps had been taken with Final Fantasy IV and V in this regard, Kitase and Sakaguchi felt that the narrative focus on the characters themselves was still one-dimensional and lacking. Based on that overarching objective, the decision was taken to introduce a huge cast of characters, with each one having a specific purpose within the story, and with the majority of them being developed in such a way that depending on the lens used by the player, it would be possible for each of them to be seen as the protagonist of the story. And this was a major difference from previous games, which had a canonically defined protagonist such as Bart or Cecil. Due to the scale of the task though, Kitase decided to adopt an innovative approach to development. It would have been easy for him, as the overlord in charge of drama, to create all the characters and then delegate their development to the team. But he took the opposite approach, putting faith in his team to collectively come up with the characters. This meant almost the entire development team, irrespective of department, then had a say in who these characters were and the creation of their identities and backstories, as opposed to it solely falling on the shoulders of, say, Sakaguchi or Kitase. Through this process, they ended up with almost 20 characters, with each one depicted at the stage by nothing more than playable class names. For example, one character was simply called Thief, while another was called Gambler. Once the array of characters was then established and everyone was happy, Kitase then opened up the floor for people from all across the development team to write short stories about these characters, which were meant to offer an identity and a hint at their backstory. Tetsuya Nomura, one of the art directors, pitched in ideas for the Gambler, who became known as Setzer, and the Ninja, who was then named Shadow. Akiyoshi Ota, who was a battle planner, then proposed some ideas around the Painter, who was subsequently named Realm, and he naturally then took charge of Strago and all the NPCs associated with their story. Having seen some of her friends step up, Kaori Tanaka, aka Soraya Saga, who was a field graphic designer at the time, opted for the Monk and Machinist, who became known as Sabin and Edgar Figaro, and she then took on the responsibility of building out their characters, creating a considerable amount of depth for the brothers that went far above and beyond what was expected. Sakaguchi then took responsibility for developing the backstories of Terra and Locke, who were planned to be prominent characters, while Kitase, perhaps due to his wider role, looked after two playable characters who were supposed to have lesser roles in Celes and Gao, and the main antagonist, Kefka. Other characters such as Cyan and Mog were then picked up by other team members, but there were also characters who were proposed and then cut as the story developed, as they just didn't work with the way the scenario was progressing. Cyan, for example, was meant to have a close bond with a woman named Angela. Many of these decisions fell on Kitase as the scenario director. Even though each of the individual characters was overseen by a different member of the team, his job was to ensure the various arcs pulled together to make sense in the context of the wider narrative that was developing, but if they didn't, cuts had to happen. Perhaps the crucial part of this approach, however, was just its dynamic nature. As there was no set path for the story to take, there was a huge amount of fluidity, and everyone was able to riff off each other depending on developments that were being made elsewhere. And this then facilitated a ton of change, even within characters themselves. Terra, for example, underwent numerous revisions throughout development. From the outset, Sakaguchi always knew he wanted the character to be half human, half Esper, but nothing else was decided. In earlier drafts, this meant Terra was a man before being adjusted to a very sprightly young woman with short blonde hair. Locke also could have undergone changes too, but for very different reasons. As Square had become quite siloed following their new approach to development, even though Mystic Quest was a game that adorned the Final Fantasy name, because it was developed in near isolation by Development Team 6, aka Square Osaka, nobody in Development Team 1 had played the game or had any real clue about what the game contained. It wasn't until a significant amount of preparatory work had been done on Locke that someone on the team then actually played Mystic Quest in preparation for its Japanese launch, and they realised that throughout the localization process, the character called Tristan had been renamed to Locke, and that this version of Locke was also a treasure hunter. Upon making this realization, Sakaguchi made the creative decision to keep those aspects of Locke intact in Final Fantasy VI, but it highlighted the peril of video game development and secrecy in general. Their worst fear was working on something at the same time as one of their contemporaries, but then being accused of plagiarism or being derivative because a competitor had released their project first. But whereas Locke introduced a layer of stress for Sakaguchi, Mog was a more fun addition to the roster. By this point in the franchise, Moogles had started to become a recurring race. The initial plan was, of course, to have them appear within Final Fantasy II, but after they were replaced by beavers, the design was resurfaced for Final Fantasy III and was then reused in Final Fantasy V. This time, the developers wanted to give Moogles more prominence, and it saw the creation of a playable character called Mog. But to make Mog stand out, they decided to make some significant modifications, and this related to narrative context and also the design of Moogles in general. It saw the white, fluffy body retained, as well as the small wings, but the dimensions were changed to make Moogles more slender. More focus was also placed on the Moogle's face, which now featured the squinted or closed eyes, and the wings were made smaller. Perhaps the most noticeable inclusion, though, was the pom-pom. This was a ball of fur on a long antenna, and it hadn't featured in any of the previous designs, but it helped to make the Moogle a bit more distinctive, and this made a huge difference to how audiences reacted to the character. One of the characters who saw the most change over time, however, was not Terra or Locke, or even Mog. Instead, it was Celes, a character given to Kitase due to her role supposedly being quite small by comparison. At the beginning of the project, Sakaguchi had provided a rough outline of the scenario, and he fully expected this to be used as a guide as opposed to a hard and fast rule. There were, however, a few non-negotiable elements, and one of them was that an event scene needed to be created that took place in an opera. How and when this happened was left up to Kitase, but its inclusion was mandatory, as Sakaguchi felt the potential spectacle could set Final Fantasy VI apart from its peers, and become a moment players talked about long after the game was released. Kitase, however, had no clue about opera, and even though Sakaguchi did suggest that he attend some operatic performances in Japan so as to prepare, Kitase just didn't have any time because development was so full on. The next best thing was therefore to collaborate with some team members who he hoped were at least somewhat knowledgeable on the subject, and he ended up spending days locked into deep brainstorming sessions with Nobuo Uematsu and Hideo Manaba, before then deciding to use a frame of reference he was comfortable with as the basis for the scene, a sequence from Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much. The next question was then, who should serve as the focal point for this scene? As the overlord of the scenario, Kitase from the outset attempted to remain as agnostic as he could to each of the characters, and this was for three reasons. 1. He didn't want to be accused of favouring the characters he was working on. 2. He didn't want any of the other creators to feel as though their work was less or more important than any other. And 3. He wanted to make sure the scenario adhered to that original goal of having no defined protagonist. Every story was to have equal importance. This was why the assignment of Celes and Gao to Kitase was so important, as in Sakaguchi's initial story draft, neither were intended to have big roles in the story. They were instead included to help add colour to the wider lore of the world. There was just one problem. After Kitase started putting the script together, he felt Celes had a more important role to play. And after speaking with Sakaguchi about this, Kitase went with his gut, delving deep into the backstory of Celes and creating relationships that connected her with Kefka and with Locke. And it also meant that she was made the main focal point of the opera scene. With this decided, Kitase next had extensive meetings with Kazuko Shibuya to ensure a purposeful array of sprites was created that ensured everything looked just right for the operatic setting. After all the pieces were then in place, all that remained was to create the event sequence, and due to the importance of the task, Kitase chose to not delegate it to the team. Instead, he oversaw the entire sequence, frame by frame. There was a reason for this, however, and it had nothing to do with not trusting other members of the staff. Instead, it came down to Kitase's background in animation and the production of stop motion. Kitase was used to creating very detailed and intricate productions using stop motion techniques, and due to the length of the opera scene and how purposeful every single element was required to be, it needed a specialized attention to detail to ensure everything, no matter how big or small, was intentional. every aspect of the sequence had to play its part to ensure it adhered to Sakaguchi's initial brief and lived up to expectations. The continual development of Celes then led to another purposeful inclusion. When the project started, there were never any plans for a world of ruin to exist. Kefka was supposed to be a traditional antagonist who just needed to be stopped, as had always been the case. But development progressed much faster than any of the senior team expected, and instead of shipping the game early, they decided to push things further. This would have never been possible had they opted for a static approach to development from the outset, but with Kitase preferring a dynamic approach, they just continued the story and wrote a second act that was never meant to exist. When someone on the team then proposed that perhaps they should actually just let Kefka win and have the second act deal with the fallout, they decided to plough ahead in earnest. Such a decision allowed for a considerable amount of character development, and one of the biggest beneficiaries of this was Celes. Due to how much Celes' role had grown, Kitase felt she deserved a scene that tugged on the heartstrings of those who had been sucked in by her narrative arc, and due to their connection via the Gestalian Empire, Kitase decided this sequence should involve Cid. The idea was to make something sincere and sad, but not hopeless, a perfect allegory for the situation the entire world found itself in. This meant that even though the canonical conclusion of Celes' arc was the death of Cid and her attempted suicide, it was possible to avoid this sequence by saving Cid's life, should the player figure out how to navigate the minigame that was stacked against them. Other characters were also given their moment in the spotlight, including the likes of Cyan, who could be involved in a small side quest that related to delivering letters to a widow, and this showed how much effort the scenario team and the individual creatives who built out their characters went to ensure that everything meshed together. But it also showed the brilliance and meticulous nature of Kitase, who, as a scenario director, was required to stitch everything together and adapt, expand, or truncate when necessary. This could not have been an easy task, given the size of the playable cast and the temporary cast, but also the huge array of NPCs that needed to be created. Compared to Final Fantasy V, the roster was significant, with many characters having NPCs that related specifically to their own story arcs. Setzer, for example, had a story that related to an NPC called Daryl, while Duncan and Vargas were important parts of Sabin's backstory. Other elements were also put in place to stoke mystery, with it being left up to the player to determine how certain narratives panned out, and in the case of Shadow and Realm, the relationships that existed between characters. As Kitase and other members of the team continued to organically develop the story, Hiroyuki Ito worked with his team to ensure that broader progression systems and combat application worked hand in hand, supporting the narrative wherever possible to create a cohesive experience. Due to the sheer size of the playable cast, it was decided early on that a traditional job system, the likes of which have been seen in Final Fantasy I, III, and V, just wouldn't make sense. So they decided to build up the system adopted in Final Fantasy IV, where characters were given set jobs that they would keep throughout the entire duration of the playthrough. There was a risk that this may cut down on the volume of potential party configuration options, but due to the size of the cast, there was a sense that the game still had the capacity to offer a lot of variety with regards to playstyles, and they also made some purposeful changes in relation to how everything was implemented. The first major change was that they wanted to remove the restrictions imposed by Final Fantasy IV, whereby throughout much of the experience, players had a limited choice about how to solve the problems put before them. Final Fantasy V had been a breath of fresh air in this regard, and they wanted Final Fantasy VI to be similar. So even though there were certain story segments put in place that forced certain characters to be used, their impact was diminished. And outside of moments of learning, the player was afforded a lot more choice about the party they wanted to use, with some recruitable characters even being missable. The other major change came around character progression. In every prior game to Final Fantasy V, outside of Final Fantasy II of course, a character's ability set was always determined by their selected job, whether that be a fixed role or an adaptive one. Final Fantasy V then challenged this via the Mastery system, and it was this system that saw significant expansion. Every character did still have the capacity to learn new innate abilities as they grew throughout the game, but these abilities could now be supplemented with limited restrictions applied, and this was made possible through the expanded use of Espers. After being introduced in Final Fantasy III and their subsequent narrative involvement in Final Fantasy IV, the role and impact of summons had ended up being quite profound. In Final Fantasy VI, this notion was pushed even further, as summons, now known as espers, were integrated into the story in a direct way by being connected to one of the game's main protagonists, Terra, and having their own world and society. But to make sure their impact was felt beyond the story, espers were then retained as summonable beings and integrated into character progression. Ever since being promoted to oversee general gameplay, Ito had always attempted to make sure his systems acted as extensions of the narrative, and this time it saw espers become equipable components, capable of teaching characters new spells and boosting attributes. Each esper, via the Magicite system, was given a unique array of spells that could be taught. The caveat was that each Magicite could only be assigned to one character at a time. This meant players had to be strategic, as spells were not learned instantly. Such a system also facilitated a huge growth in the number of available summonable beings. This had already been steadily rising from the 8 that were introduced in Final Fantasy III, but Final Fantasy VI included more than 4 times as many, and some of them were incredibly powerful. To complement the Magicite system and provide even more options to players, Ito and his team also created relics, or accessories as they were known in the Japanese version of the game. Alongside innate abilities and learnt spells, relics were designed to provide special bonuses to players, and up to 2 could be equipped by any character. Some relics, for example, could be used to boost specific stats, while others protected against negative status effects or auto-casted positive ones. But there were also selections of relics that went far beyond this. A handful of relics, for example, were able to provide job-based functionality from previous games that was no longer accessible due to that system being removed. An example came via the sprint shoes, where if they were equipped, then they allowed the party to walk faster in towns and dungeons, just like had been possible in Final Fantasy V via the sprint ability that was previously exclusive to thieves. The Ward Bangle and Malulu's Charm also altered one of the fundamental mechanics that had been in place since the original game, by either halving the random encounter rate or removing random encounters completely. And then there was the Growth Egg, which doubled the EXP an equipped character received after every battle. Other relics, such as the Knight's Code, then brought back the cover mechanic, while characters who equipped the Dragoon Boots saw their regular attack command changed into the jump command, meaning that every character could act like a Dragoon even though the job did not feature in the game. Other aspects the team wanted to explore related to difficulty. To ensure players were able to overcome problems, the aforementioned systems meant that magic was a command accessible to every character. Espers were not locked behind certain jobs either, and bespoke commands were added via relics. This meant there was a significant increase in the total number of commands available to almost every character. New attack states were also added, including player-led pincer attacks that could add a layer of strategy and ease depending on whether players were able to exploit the advantages of these new states. But above all else, the developers wanted to try and make the game easier to complete. The only challenge was accomplishing this without being accused of dumbing the game down. In the past, they had tried different approaches to solve this problem, including publishing a completely separate version of Final Fantasy IV called Easy Type, and by making Final Fantasy V very accessible, with extra layers of depth available for people who wanted it. Both of these approaches had their pros and cons, but it still felt like barriers may exist for people who weren't role-playing enthusiasts and may struggle to get through some of the encounters. Numerous ideas were proposed for how to make Final Fantasy VI even more accessible for those types of players, but one of the ideas that stood out came from Tetsuya Nomura. Nomura suggested that the player be given a brand new, unique ability that only triggered for players who were deemed to be struggling based on their current HP. It was a genius concept, as unlike suggesting the player should lower the difficulty, it was near impossible for this ability to be considered patronizing or demeaning. Instead, the ability served to empower players and make them feel amazing, just like when their favourite characters were beaten down in an anime, but then mustered up the strength to carry on and rise up to win against all the odds. The move ended up being called a Desperation Attack, dubbed a near-death special skill in the Japanese version, and each character was given one such skill. that had a 1 in 16 chance of being activated should they be below 1/8 of their maximum HP after 20 seconds of the battle commencing. Should the desperation attack then be triggered, players got to bear witness to attacks with incredible power. There were also amazing visual spectacles, and it ended up being quite a treat for those who ever got to see it. All things considered, these numerous tweaks to the battle scene and character progression helped to make Final Fantasy VI feel like a serious evolution on its predecessor, and this was accomplished even though the ATB system itself saw minimal improvements. This then showed the strength of that core system, but also the talent of the team at large. To work alongside all the efforts made to ensure Final Fantasy VI delivered an impactful and compelling gameplay experience, a high degree of faith was also placed on the art and music departments to hold up their end of the bargain. Those artists who had shown real potential in Final Fantasy V were given purposeful promotions, and each of them was placed in charge of a different aspect. Kazuko Shibuya, for example, was now given much more autonomy than ever before, and this had a direct impact on the speed at which they were able to work. One of the first major decisions she made was to push for larger character sprites to be used. For a long time, the sprites had stayed within the same realm, but Shibuya felt larger sprites would allow for a greater level of fidelity amongst the cast, while also giving them more presence on screen. And with so many characters, both playable and non-playable, being created, being able to distinguish between them more easily was of paramount importance. The other major impact around Shibuya's autonomy and seniority was that she now also had more influence over the final product, and the individual designs of sprites that manifested in-game. In the past, Yoshitaka Amano's work had almost always been used as a reference for pixel artists, and even though Shibuya had sometimes provided the basis, such as her creation for the logo of Final Fantasy III, Amano was then tasked with cementing the concept and making the final version. This time around though, the workflow was different, as Shibuya and Amano were working in tandem as opposed to being part of the same linear chain. This meant conflicts had the potential to arise, and in those instances, Shibuya was given authority to overrule Amano, with her work deemed as the primary source. This situation ended up happening quite a few times, with two notable examples being with the Magitech armor and the design of Terra. Both times, Shibuya and Amano created different interpretations of the same thing, and it's why the in-game representation of the Magitech armor differs from the concept art, some of which appeared on the Japanese box art. Terra was perhaps the most pronounced change, however. Throughout the design process, Terra went through numerous revisions, not least because of the gender swap. After this, Terra was designed to be a young girl with short blonde hair, but Shibuya felt this wasn't unique enough and overruled Amano. She felt that too many characters had ended up with blonde hair, and so made the executive decision to switch Terra's in-game hair colour to green as a way of making her stand out more on the screen. The other, now senior artists, also took more responsibility for their own areas, and Tetsuya Takahashi in particular was known for speaking his mind and challenging decisions that were being made elsewhere. And this even saw him doing something that few dared, challenging Sakaguchi. Taking such a step was tantamount to career suicide given how much authority Sakaguchi wielded within the company. But whenever Takahashi felt passionate about something, he didn't just want to sit back and not act on his moments of inspiration. One such instance, a game related to the Magitech armor. Even though they already had two visual identities for this important piece of technology, Takahashi, who was put in charge of creating the game's opening sequence, where Magitech suits were to be shown walking through the snow, decided he liked neither Shibuya's design nor Amano's design. Takahashi himself had developed a huge fascination with mechs, and felt he could create a more compelling design. So despite being given strict instructions to follow Shibuya's existing designs to the letter, he took a huge risk and went against the directive. What Takahashi then delivered was stellar. He knew that coming to Sakaguchi with a half-baked product would never work, so he made it as good as he possibly could. And when he then showed it to his superiors, even though it went against everything that they had requested, they all had to admit, even Sakaguchi, that this new version was much better than what they had envisioned in the first place, even though it did introduce a third visual identity for the Magitech armor. This then typified the mentality of Development Team 1. They felt they were the best, and they wanted to prove it, In the past, people working in the presentation department often had to cut corners to hit deadlines or deal with technological limitations. But with many now working on their third game for the Super Famicom, they had developed new, efficient methods for producing assets, and this saw a fundamental shift in terms of how they all operated. Even though some elements may have resembled what was seen in previous entries, everything was reworked under the hood, rebuilt from the ground up to be way more efficient, and this then allowed them to pack so much more content into the game. Pride also came into play too. Numerous games went to market throughout production, but if any featured things that were similar or better than what the team were already working on, the decision was often taken to start again from scratch. Such an instance happened following the release of Yasumi Matsuno's Ogre Battle. After playing the game, Hirokatsu Sasaki, who was working on the creation of magic effects to be used within the battle scene, ended up scrapping almost all of his work. Because if they wanted to be seen as the best, they had to be the best. They couldn't afford to rest on their laurels. The other aspect of presentation related to music, and this was where some potential issues arose. Unlike many others of the team who were super enthused to be working on another Final Fantasy game, Nobuo Uematsu was not. Ever since joining Square, Uematsu had been given a relentless schedule, tasked with composing music for the vast majority of their games. This burden was softening slightly following the hiring of Kenji Ito, but Uematsu had still been required to compose the soundtracks for almost 20 games in just 7 years. Across the 5 Final Fantasy games alone, he had composed almost 5 hours of in-game music, with over 2 of those relating to Final Fantasy V. Countless more music had also been produced that just didn't make the cut, and it had all been composed with very tight deadlines, requiring near-permanent residence at the office and many sleepless nights. On top of that, Uematsu also had to create sound effects for some of these projects, all while being required to work on plenty of other supplemental content that was being produced in relation to his own works, such as the Symphonic Suite and the various arrangement albums that were now expected to be part of the pre- and post-marketing cycle for each game. The other strain was that alongside Sakaguchi, Uematsu was now the second most famous person at the company, and was often asked to do interviews due to his high profile within the video games industry. Following the completion of Final Fantasy V, Uematsu took all of this into consideration when thinking about what to do next. The grim reality of burnout was creeping in, and Uematsu was very close to quitting Square and the video games industry as a whole, hoping to move on and work in a less stressful environment. Sakaguchi and Kitase, however, convinced him to stay on for just one more project. The argument they used was that they felt Uematsu wouldn't want to look back at his career with regrets if he quit then, not when they were just about to work on what they believed to be their best ever game. They needed someone of his talents to bring everything together, and after being emboldened by their faith in him, Uematsu opted to stay, resolving to make the soundtrack of Final Fantasy VI something special, as it was probably going to be his last. Kitase and Ito, owing to their collaborative approach to leadership and development, then brought Uematsu more into the fold than he was ever allowed to be when Sakaguchi was sitting at the top of the tree, asking for his opinions on aspects of design that didn't just relate to music. This approach then invigorated Uematsu further. He was given room to experiment, and he genuinely felt as though his work would make a difference to the final product that extended beyond the realms of what he had accomplished in the past. This notion was evidenced through quite a few pieces of music, but perhaps the one that epitomized this the most was Dancing Mad. Just as with every other aspect of the game, this track was never intended to exist. But after the world of Ruin became a possibility, every single person on the team wanted to show just how far they could take things. This manifested via incredible scenario development for each character, some stunning visual designs such as the Tower of the Gods, which was created by Tetsuya Nomura, and Dancing Mad, a monumental piece of music due to how it was structured. Up until this point, final boss music had always been quite one-dimensional due to the battles themselves, but with Dancing Mad, Uematsu pushed everything to the next level, creating a multi-tiered piece of music that evolved as the battle itself evolved. It saw Uematsu compose a piece of music that clocked in at a staggering 17 minutes and 40 seconds in length, and everyone on the team was blown away. All of these elements combined showed just how much the team had grown. They had become efficient and adaptive, to the point that they were able to increase the scope of the game significantly, as the original scope had been accomplished in less than 6 months of development. It also showed the ambition though. They could have easily just stopped there and released a decent game, generating strong returns for the company, but none of them would have been satisfied with that approach. Their collective desire to become the absolute dominant force on the market pushed them to achieve greatness, and they demanded nothing but the best from each other. This was, however, a blessing and a curse, and development still had its ups and downs. Sakaguchi, for example, had to contend with the birth of his daughter Aya when they were knee-deep in development, and as the leader of the team, he couldn't afford to be distracted by this major life event. Because of how much extra work they'd done, the debugging phase also ended up being more brutal than with any previous game, as everyone was forced to pitch in, irrespective of their role. One of the biggest challenges then came around memory management optimization. The game was huge, and unlike today, where there are numerous tools that can assist with debugging, even though Square did have a dedicated testing team at this point, they had no tools or software to aid in the detection of bugs and errors. It was a manual process, and as the deadline approached, more and more bugs were found due to them relying so much on human judgment calls for memory management. It saw staff members with spare time pulled in from all corners to assist, including famed artists like Shibuya. She noted in an interview once just how relentless it was due to the tight deadlines. To paraphrase, she said, "I worked on it all night after night, but every morning they'd give me an updated ROM. Unfortunately, in a single day, someone as bad at games as myself could only reach the midpoint of Final Fantasy VI, where the world is destroyed. So every morning I'd come back to work for another day of debugging, feeling a little dejected, thinking, here we go again, another day of searching for Gao on the Veld." And this emphasized another problem. Every time an optimization was made, the game had to be playtested again to ensure it hadn't broken something else. Despite their best efforts, countless bugs made it into the final product, and some ended up becoming quite notorious, such as Vanish Doom, the Sketch Glitch, and a bug that affected the Cursed Shield. By the end, despite them being originally finished very quickly, Final Fantasy VI had ended up spending the longest time in development since Final Fantasy III. But the team were supremely confident with what they had produced, and were eager for expectant fans to get their hands on the finished product. After what felt like a smooth, but also very taxing and emotionally draining development cycle, thoughts moved over to the marketing team and how they were going to position Final Fantasy VI to an ever-expectant market. The previous installment had cemented Final Fantasy as one of the hottest properties, and fans were desperate for more, but choice decisions had to be made around how and when to ship the product. After all, they had chosen to take a slightly longer time developing Final Fantasy VI than initially intended, and they'd also opted to produce the game on a 24MB ROM cartridge, which increased production costs, and those needed to be passed on to the consumer. Dragon Quest also loomed as the elephant in the room, but Square were confident with their own product and the decisions they had taken, and decided to be bold and brash. One of the common themes over the past 5 years was that Yuji Horii and the marketing team over at NX were always keen for consumers to be aware of what was on the horizon in relation to Dragon Quest. In the earlier days of the franchise, this had worked quite well as the games came thick and fast, but as development times got longer and longer, announcing their games early started to have the opposite effect. Consumers ended up getting burnt out by the constant prospect of news and then nothing significant being delivered as more and more time passed. With Dragon Quest V and Final Fantasy V releasing so close to each other, consumers then wondered which publisher would blink first by revealing their plans for the next iteration, and once again, it was Enix. During the summer of 1993, less than a year after the release of Dragon Quest V, Enix held a press conference where they announced that development had already commenced on Dragon Quest VI, and they sat in front of a general banner that offered no branding and only 2 small pieces of concept art. They stopped short of saying anything else of note. There was no planned release window revealed, nor did they talk about anything that the game planned to contain. The announcement was clearly designed to try and get ahead of their rival. NX were beginning to feel threatened by Final Fantasy and wanted to ensure the conversation stayed with them, even if they had nothing significant worth talking about. Square, though, for their part, were more than happy to let Enix talk. After the release of Final Fantasy V, their internal focus shifted onto other properties, such as the next iterations into the Mana and Romancing Saga franchises. Both had the potential to be smash hits, and this proved to be the case when Seiken Densetsu 2 launched around the same time as that Dragon Quest III reveal. It sold over 500,000 copies during a 2-week launch period, with the figure rising to almost 800,000 within a month on sale. This was a significant result for Square, as the previous game, which had launched on the Game Boy, had only managed to sell 700,000 copies in its lifetime, and at less than half the price point. This saw the Mana franchise go from one capable of generating 3.4 billion yen during its lifetime to one capable of generating 7.8 billion yen in just 4 weeks. Final Fantasy VI was then announced right at the end of the year to coincide with the huge launch of Romancing Saga 2. It managed to perform even better than Seiken Densetsu 2, with 600,000 copies shipped within its first 2 weeks on sale. But Enix were also active around this period, releasing Illusion of Gaia and Dragon Quest I and II for the Super Famicom in the surrounding weeks. The promising thing for Square, however, was that neither of Enix's games were able to match the performance of Seiken Densetsu 2 nor Romancing Saga 2, and this showed that the consumer base had started to develop a closer affinity with games associated with the Square brand, as opposed to them being from one specific IP. Similar to the reveal of Final Fantasy V, the marketing and publishing teams decided, along with Sakaguchi, that there needed to be a quick turnaround between announcement and launch. This was only possible, however, if the game was almost complete, and Sakaguchi wanted to ensure that the announcement was held back until at least 80% of production was done, leaving only finessing and debugging left to complete. Based on the size and strength of the brand, they believed this was the optimum approach. Go huge with the announcement and bombard people with immediate reasons why they should play this game. By taking this approach, there was no room for people to gain incorrect assumptions about what the game may be, which in turn meant their expectations were less likely to be misaligned. Alongside a huge print spread which contained very detailed information about Final Fantasy VI, they then shocked audiences by revealing that despite being announced in December of 1993, Final Fantasy VI was going to be released just 4 months later, in March of 1994. The benefits of this approach were then laid bare. Dragon Quest VI had been a near permanent mainstay at the top of Famitsu's Most Wanted charts ever since its announcement during the summer. But within just 1 week, Final Fantasy VI had snatched its spot at the top, and it wasn't even a competition. Dragon Quest VI had been eclipsed, losing almost all of its momentum. Alongside the build-up to this reveal, the marketing department at Square had also been working hard on something that Sakaguchi had been clamoring for, a legitimate collaboration with Torishima and Jump Magazine. Ever since their fateful conversation following the release of Final Fantasy III, Torishima had been suitably impressed by what Square had accomplished with Final Fantasy IV and V, and he'd been so impressed that after seeing what was being worked on behind the scenes with Final Fantasy VI, that he finally gave the Final Fantasy brand his seal of approval. The resulting campaign was planned to be huge, and this was yet another body blow to Enix, as for the longest time, Dragon Quest had had near exclusive expanded coverage within Jump. What became known as the Final Fantasy Coliseum ended up as a comprehensive feature that was planned to last for an extended period that encompassed pre-launch and post-launch support. It saw unique comic strips produced to provide backstories on specific characters and draw the Shonen Jump audience in, while people like Sakaguchi and Kaori Tanaka answered mailbag questions, diving deep into the creative process for each character and revealing detailed lore information and how the characters had evolved throughout the development process. This was not the end of their efforts, though. Square had become known for their impressive TV commercials, with Final Fantasy IV focusing on a real-life ostrich and Final Fantasy V using innovative computer graphics. To continue on with this theme, for Final Fantasy VI, they decided to create a live-action trailer. To ensure it retained the wow factor, the creative team decided to have Terra somehow be magically transported into modern-day Japan, all while riding the Magitech armor, just like in the box art and the game's opening sequence. Such a vision required the use of green screen technology and the hiring of a model who could serve as a realistic representation of Terra. After a search, they ended up hiring a 13-year-old French model called Audrey Drew, creating a suitably appropriate costume and allowing her to retain the blonde hair as opposed to dyeing it green to match the in-game representation. Alongside this, Square also produced 2 promotional soundtracks called Final Fantasy VI Stars Volume 1 and 2, and they also, in collaboration with V-Jump, produced a unique piece of music that featured the entire core development staff. And to make it even more endearing to would-be players, they even had the staff sing along, with Sakaguchi and Tetsuya Nomura performing the solo roles. All of this was necessary though, as not only did Square want to try and further close the gap to Dragon Quest, but they also had to try and get people so excited about the prospect of playing the game that they'd be forgiving about the incredible price tag that had been placed on the cost of entry. Due to the use of that 24MB cartridge, Square decided to hike the retail price up by a considerable margin, having chosen to pass on the extra cost to consumers, instead of absorbing it themselves. This meant Final Fantasy VI retailed for 11,400 yen, making it one of the most expensive games released on the system to that point. At the time, 11,400 yen was the equivalent of $110, but by today's money, when accounting for inflation, it meant Final Fantasy VI went on sale for the equivalent of $234. It was an incredible fee, but based on what Square had accomplished before with not just the Final Fantasy franchise, but also Romancing Saga and Mana, and the success of their short but sharp marketing campaign, people were willing to pay the fee. And this was in spite of the game being slightly delayed due to that extended debugging phase, with Square using the additional time to create even more hype. During its first 2 days on sale, Final Fantasy VI went on to sell 1,154,360 copies, with a further 600,000 copies sold over the next 14 days. This placed Final Fantasy VI well ahead of the likes of Seiken Densetsu 2 and Romancing Saga, but perhaps the biggest milestone was what it meant in comparison to Dragon Quest. Final Fantasy V had helped to close the gap, but Final Fantasy VI had sold at such a rapid pace that it had not only closed the gap completely, but created a new one where Dragon Quest was now the franchise that had to play catch-up. And what made this all the more impressive was that price point, as the feat had been accomplished despite retailing at almost 2,000 yen more than most other games on the market at the time. This then meant that Final Fantasy VI generated 22.6 billion yen, or just over $200 million, within its first 4 weeks on sale, an incredible accomplishment for any developer or publisher of video games at the time. Shortly after launch, reviews from professional critics then started to go live, and amongst them was a very commendable 37 out of 40 from Famitsu. There had been a gradual upward trend for Final Fantasy games ever since the original game had scored 34 out of 40, but Final Fantasy V had represented a regression in this regard. Final Fantasy VI addressed this decline and also set a new benchmark, surpassing the scores of 36 out of 40 that were achieved by Final Fantasy III and IV. Amongst the 4 reviewers, 2 gave it a perfect score, and there were plenty of plaudits. Hirokazu Hamamura, for example, said that Final Fantasy VI had challenged the conventional frameworks of role-playing games, while also challenging what it meant to be a Final Fantasy game. But due to a combination of its presentation and story, it had succeeded, surpassing everything previously associated with the franchise to define a new path forward. Miki Watanabe, one of the 2 who awarded the perfect score, lamented only having limited space to convey her thoughts within the magazine. And this was because the graphics, battle sequences, and scenario were simply stunning and amazing to her. Everything sounded very positive, but consumers who purchased the game weren't quite as sure. When readers of Family Computer magazine provided their thoughts across 6 standard categories of characters, music, value for money, operability, immersion, and originality, Final Fantasy VI actually scored worse than Final Fantasy V in every single category. The area that lagged behind this the most was value for money, something that perhaps wasn't too surprising given the significant hike up in price point. Regardless, by the end of the Super Famicom's life cycle, Final Fantasy VI ended up selling 2.55 million copies. This was more than Final Fantasy V, but only just, with the difference being only 100,000 copies. But the most important metric for Square was the revenue. Due to its high price point, this meant Final Fantasy VI generated approximately 29 billion yen, compared to Final Fantasy V's 24 billion yen. And at the time, this was the equivalent of almost an extra $100 million. The results of Final Fantasy VI meant it was by far the best performing commercial product Square had ever produced, and when combined with the returns from Romancing Saga 2 and Seiken Densetsu 2, both of which also grossed over $100 million each, it saw these three games alone generate well over $500 million in Japan, the equivalent of around $1.2 billion in today's money, when factoring in inflation. With such strong performance under their belt, Square then turned their attention back to the challenge they had struggled to overcome, replicating this success in North America. After the release of Final Fantasy IV as Final Fantasy II, Square had gotten themselves into something of a muddle with regards to the North American market. Even though not much physical time had passed between the releases of Final Fantasy on the Nintendo Entertainment System and Final Fantasy II on the next generation of consoles, consumers just hadn't become as enthused about playing role-playing games on consoles as they had in Japan, and the two games also didn't feel that similar. This wasn't all that surprising, given that two of the Japanese entries had been skipped, and all of these factors combined to see the North American release of Final Fantasy IV sell around 2/3 of its predecessor. Mystic Quest was then created to try and help solve the problem, but even though it did sell more copies than Final Fantasy IV, its lower price points saw it generate less revenue. Plans were in place to release a localized version of Final Fantasy V, but after seeing how much Mystic Quest had floundered, these plans were eventually shelved, as they thought it had much less chance of resonating with the North American audience than Final Fantasy VI, which placed more emphasis on narrative and less on systems. After the decision had been made, responsibility was then turned over to Ted Woolsey to localize the Japanese script into English. Ted had already done some provisional work on Final Fantasy V, but his main contributions after joining Square's North American division came on Mystic Quest and Seiken Densetsu 2, which was localized as Secret of Mana for its North American launch. For Final Fantasy VI, the localization was expected to happen at a rapid pace. They just didn't want to lose a march, especially as conversations were already starting to progress towards the next generation of consoles, and as history had shown, sales had the potential to dip down once consumers started to have their heads turned by more ambitious and technologically advanced software. With these factors combined, Ted was only given 30 days to produce a complete localization of Final Fantasy VI, with no time to prepare beforehand and no chance to speak with the development team to ask questions or explain certain aspects of the story. There was also no real guidance put in place around continuity. Instead, Ted was given complete autonomy to change aspects to ensure they resonated more with the target market based on his own experiences. It was a gargantuan task, but Ted stood up to the plate and attempted to deliver as best as he could. But almost as soon as he started, the lack of possible communication with the team in Japan led to immediate problems being encountered, and perhaps one of the most pronounced was around names and general naming conventions. Due to the way both languages worked, conveying the same intention often became challenging due to character restrictions, and this issue became more pronounced within the battle scene, as there was limited space within the user interface. In Final Fantasy IV, for example, a strict 8-character limit was imposed on enemies, and although this was increased to 10 characters for Final Fantasy VI, it still caused issues between Japanese and English because many Japanese katakana symbols contained 2 letters. The infamous Great Morbol, for example, was named in the Japanese version using 8 characters. The straight Romaji interpretation then expanded this to 15 characters, and in English, Great Morbol itself is 12 characters, including the space. Ted therefore had to come up with a creative interpretation for how to shrink this down. And there were countless instances of this, with another being Tyrannosaurus, a word that is represented in katakana using only 8 characters. To solve the problem, Ted sometimes just created a shortened version of the word by removing spaces, double letters, or unnecessary vowels and letters. Tyrannosaurus, for example, was shortened to Tyrannosaur. Other words were more complicated, however. The Tomberry, for example, was a brand new creation for Western audiences, having debuted in Final Fantasy V. But it was often difficult for Ted to understand whether words were meant to be literal or figurative, so instead of doing a straight translation of Tonberry, he had to make a judgment call, and this sometimes led to enemies being completely renamed. This saw the Tonberry became known as a Pug, and the aforementioned Great Maw being renamed as the Evil Oscar. The other major consideration came with name changes to specific playable characters and NPCs. In Japan, giving characters names like Tina, Dean, and Jeff had a notion of fantasy, as those names were so uncommon in that specific country that they felt majestic and in keeping with the fantasy genre. But in North America, the opposite was true. Those names were incredibly common, and in no way did they represent fantasy. They were much closer to reality. To reintroduce the element of fantasy, Ted felt compelled to change some of the character names, but this wasn't a decision he made on his own. When doing initial playtests in North America, they retained the name of Tina in association with one of the game's main protagonists, but every single individual who took part in the playtests hated the name. It was for this reason that Tina was changed to Terra, but other names ended up being changed for similar reasons. Amongst the playable cast, even though North Americans came to know the Figaro brothers as Edgar and Sabin, in Japan they were known as Edgar and Mash. Generic English names such as Dean, Billy, and Jeff were changed to Dwayne, Baram, and Gerard respectively, as they felt the names were far too common and they wanted to avoid a situation where players encountered someone with a similar name to someone they knew in real life. There was also another objective, as they knew many people liked to rename existing characters to names that meant something to them, and they wanted to avoid Locke, for example, being renamed by someone to Jeff, and then there being another Jeff that they encountered as an NPC in the game. It wasn't just the English names that were changed though, as Japanese names such as Jun, Shun, and Mina were changed to Arvis, Owain, and Elaine. Alongside this, Ted also had to contend with Nintendo's notoriously difficult rules around censorship, as alongside affecting visual assets, it also affected written assets. It saw the enemy named Virginity, for example, renamed to Madame. But they also had to rename spells such as Holy and Death, and pubs were even changed to being called cafes. This part was perhaps the most stressful too, as due to the tight turnaround times there was no room for error. Ted had to try and preempt as many of these censorship changes as possible to ensure it passed without needing multiple revisions. With everything progressing well though, Square's North American division was much more confident than they were with previous releases, and it saw them greenlight the production of a full-on television commercial that they hoped would help the game appeal to younger audiences. Channeling the attitude of that era, which had been most personified by the introduction of Sonic the Hedgehog, it saw Morg promoted to a starring role, as he served as a casting director for the game's various monsters. The tone was aggressive and full-on, and had very little to do with the actual game itself, but that was on purpose. They hoped the advert would draw kids in before the game itself did the job of getting them hooked and retaining them. When Final Fantasy VI then released, critics were impressed by what they saw. EGM awarded it a 36 out of 40, with all 4 review editors giving it a 9 out of 10. Dayton Carpenter even said it was a killer role-playing game that few companies would ever be able to match. Each of them also listed it amongst their current favourite games alongside the likes of NBA Jam, Super Metroid, and Darkstalkers. Other publications also offered similar commendations, with Video Games Magazine awarding Final Fantasy VI Role-Playing Game of the Year, and it receiving the same commendations from EGM following unanimous voting from the editors. However, despite all the positive praise and promotional activities, Final Fantasy VI yet again struggled to find its feet in North America. And whereas the Japanese launch had led to more than 2.5 million copies being sold in that region, in North America it only ended up as the 8th best-selling game to launch in that year. This could have been seen as impressive, as the game only launched in October, but its sales were way down on the likes of Mortal Kombat 2 and Donkey Kong, and based on estimates, only around 300 to 400,000 copies were ever sold in the region, which was in the same ballpark as Final Fantasy IV and Mystic Quest. This meant that despite everything Square had done, the brand had not grown by any noticeable metric in that region. In and around the launch of Final Fantasy VI in both Japan and North America, Square attempted to cement its legacy by producing plenty of supporting material. And as the game became available in more regions and on more consoles, this notion has only increased over time, bolstered by the near constant appearance of Final Fantasy VI in lists that talk about not only the best games in the franchise, but also the best games of all time. This then speaks to that original objective the developers had at the beginning of the project, and the continued conversation around Final Fantasy VI proves how successful they were, as the game has endured across its numerous re-releases and revisions. In Japan, Square did everything they could to channel hype within the short window they had given themselves. Some of the strong initiatives related to the Final Fantasy original video animations that aired around the same time as Final Fantasy VI launched, as well as adaptations of Final Fantasy VI itself within VJump. But due to how much some of the staff cared about these initiatives, they weren't just happy to be passive. Keiro Tanaka, who worked on developing the scenarios relating to the Figaro brothers, epitomized this. After contributing to an interview series within VJump called the Final Fantasy Colosseum alongside her boss Sakaguchi, Tanaka decided to go further by producing her own adapted works that were not deemed an official part of the Final Fantasy VI canon. Doujinshi had been a popular medium for some time after gaining prominence in the 1980s. Tanaka had been active in their creation. But having been so involved in Final Fantasy VI, she felt there were stories that needed to be told in relation to the Figaro brothers that had no specific place within the game itself, and with no other collateral being produced, this left Tanaka to self-publish works that were her own and were not directly affiliated with Square. Entitled The Marriage of Figaro, Tales from the Desert, one of the stories featured plenty of characters from within the game itself, such as the Figaro brothers, Duncan Harcourt and Vargas, but also Gao, Cyan and Relm. But it also went much further. This saw many other members of the Figaro family introduced, including King Stuart and Queen Christiel, Edgar and Sabin's mother and father, alongside their uncles, aunts, cousins, and even grandparents. It helped to explore the impetus for Sabin's martial arts training in more detail, while also detailing the perilous Game of Thrones that was taking place, with Stuart's own brother plotting to take the throne before the king's untimely death at the hands of the Castalian Empire. The entire premise was fascinating, but because the book was published without the permission of Square, Tanaka was keen to note that it was an unofficial work and should therefore not be considered canon to the events of the game itself. Another staff member who embodied this notion was, of course, Nobuo Uematsu. Music had played a prominent part in the success of Final Fantasy, and fans had clamoured to gain access to the associated soundtracks. In the earlier years of the franchise, they were often left waiting quite a while. But as things had advanced, the marketing department realised that releasing original soundtracks ahead of a game's launch was the perfect way to generate a ton of extra revenue and build hype even further. This meant that instead of releasing on launch day, as they had done with Final Fantasy V, the original soundtrack for Final Fantasy VI launched over a week before the game, and hardcore fans who wanted to absorb everything they could about the game leapt on this official product, hoping it would satiate their cravings ahead of the actual game launching. By taking this approach, even though Final Fantasy VI as a game didn't end up selling many more copies than Final Fantasy V, the soundtracks did by comparison. This meant they increased the sales from 135,000 copies of Final Fantasy V's soundtrack to 175,000 copies with Final Fantasy VI's soundtrack. As it was also listed at a price point of 3,800 yen, this saw the soundtrack generate 665 million yen, or the equivalent of $6.5 million at the time. And given that this was only a supplemental piece of content, such results were pretty astounding. Post-launch, excitement around the music was then enriched through the release of countless other albums that were atypical of what had been released with the two previous games. Within a few weeks of the game's launch, Square first released Final Fantasy VI Special Tracks, a short album that contained the infamous VJump musical track where the entire staff were singing, alongside some unreleased town themes and a pleasant remake of Troy and Beauty from Final Fantasy IV. The final piece was then an arrangement of Techno de Chocobo using modern synths that was arranged and performed by an outfit called the Voodoo Brothers. Final Fantasy VI Special Tracks was then quickly followed up by Final Fantasy VI Grand Finale, and this fulfilled a similar slot occupied by Celtic Moon with Final Fantasy IV and Dear Friends with Final Fantasy V. However, this time Uematsu worked with Shiro Sagetsu and Tsuneyoshi Saito from Sony Records to produce comprehensive arrangements that were akin to the Symphonic Suite. These arrangements were worked on well ahead of the game's launch before being recorded by the Orchestra Sinfonica di Milano towards the middle of March, weeks before the game had even shipped. Its sales were nowhere near as strong as those of the main soundtrack, but by selling almost 34,000 copies in Japan, its sales did surpass those of Celtic Moon and Dear Friends, generating over 100 million yen, or the equivalent of over $1 million. In June, 2 months after the game's launch, Square then released the Final Fantasy VI piano collections. The format remained the same as the 2 previous albums, but this time a different arranger was used. Instead of using Shiro Sato, it saw the talents of Chiro Sagasu used instead, perhaps because of his familiarity with the soundtrack already, having worked on Grand Finale, but Sagasu's role as the arranger on this production was uncredited for many years. On the same day, Square also went live with another arrangement album called Prey. Unlike many previous albums, this was not exclusive to a single game, instead spanning the entire 8-bit and 16-bit era, introducing vocals to many of the more emotional and melodic tracks. These were worked on by Yoriko Yamabuki alongside a handful of other arrangers. Despite how new it was relative to the other games, Final Fantasy VI was represented with 2 tracks, Tina's theme, which had quickly become a fan favourite, and Kids Run Through the City Corner. Most of these activities were focused on Japan, where the game had been a huge success, but Square had not given up on North America. After the series exploded in that region following the release of Final Fantasy VII, they sought to re-release Final Fantasy VI in that market, hoping to expose the countless new fans they'd obtained to what many felt was the best prior entry. In the build-up to the launch of Final Fantasy VII, Square were taking part in one of their regular question and answer sessions with investors. A big part of this was around their upcoming pipeline and support for platforms outside of the PlayStation. These included the Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, Windows 95 PCs, and Macintoshes. In answering, the representative from Square was quite blunt. They said support for the Super Nintendo had ceased immediately, and they had no plans to produce cartridge-based games for the Nintendo 64. But they may open a dialogue with Nintendo around supporting the proposed Nintendo 64 DD attachment. They also said that support for the Macintosh was unlikely, but that for Windows, they were already planning a port of Final Fantasy VII, as well as ports of Final Fantasy V and VI, with the 6th port penciled to release in the first quarter of 1998. This ambition, however, was never realised. It's unknown who was working on the PC port of 6, but it's safe to assume it was one of either Top Dog or Eidos, as they had both attempted to port Final Fantasy V before failing in that endeavour. The PC port of Final Fantasy VI is therefore presumed to have been cancelled following their difficulties porting Final Fantasy V. Due to how much of a struggle it was to produce functional ports for the PC, Square decided to use what had been done as a foundation for a port of Final Fantasy VI on the PlayStation instead. In Japan and North America, this port was released in 1999, but different strategies ended up being adopted. Whereas in North America it was only available as part of the Final Fantasy Anthology, alongside Final Fantasy V, in Japan it was part of the Final Fantasy Collection, which contained enhanced ports of Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI. But alongside the Final Fantasy Collection, it was also possible for consumers to buy each game independently. For this release, the plan was to introduce some quality of life improvements, while introducing high-quality FM sequences that were designed to help bring the 2D characters to life, and ensure that those who are playing the games for the first time, presumably after also playing Final Fantasy VII or VIII, felt a bit more at home with the experience. The major downside, however, was that Final Fantasy VI was designed for the Super Famicom, not the PlayStation, and Toze, the company put in charge of the port, struggled to ensure a smooth transition. As a ROM-based platform, the Super Famicom had lightning-quick load times, and this enabled fast transitions between the various scenes that were adopted. The CD-ROM format, however, was much slower at reading information, and this meant the PlayStation version of Final Fantasy VI had much slower load times than its original. Perhaps due to extra logistics relating to localization, the European launch on the PlayStation came 3 years after the Japanese version, and it was only available as a standalone package, as opposed to being bundled with another game. Kind of, as instead of being packaged with Final Fantasy IV or V, it came with a playable demo of Final Fantasy X. Due to the delay, Square were able to fix some of the issues with the original port, however, with Toze having found a way to remove a lot of the load time issues that plagued the Japanese and North American versions. Some years later, Final Fantasy VI Advance was then launched as the last part of the finest Fantasy for Advance series, but the wait was worth it for fans of the original game. Countless enhancements were made to this particular version, and they related to almost every aspect, from from visuals through to localization, quality of life adjustments, and even bonus content. On the visual side, work was done to improve sprites from the original game, and backgrounds were also enhanced by increasing the brightness and offering more vibrant colours, and portraits were created for important characters. Adjustments were made to the original Japanese script for its release in that region, but outside of Japan, Square Enix commissioned the creation of a brand new English script. This was overseen by Tom Slattery, and with the benefit of time and more open dialogue with the people who worked on the original game, it was made much more faithful to the original Japanese source. Much of the word-based censorship was also reverted. Perhaps the most notable aspect of Final Fantasy VI Advance, however, was the extra content. 4 new Espers were added, alongside the Dragon's Den, which featured the previously cut Kaiser Dragon and the Soul Shrine. These were then accompanied by new ultimate weapons, which gave veterans something extra to enjoy outside of the main campaign itself. Earlier in the same year that Final Fantasy VI Advance launched, Square Enix has also started a new line of titles by releasing the Final Fantasy III Remake. This was then followed up by a Final Fantasy IV Remake, and there was a strong assumption that remakes of Final Fantasy V and VI were to follow soon after. But despite Square Enix having that same ambition, those remakes never materialized. Having seen the 2 previous games, Tomoya Asano and his team did not want to continue just remaking older properties. Instead, they wanted to use everything they'd learnt to make an original Final Fantasy game, and this became known as Final Fantasy The 4 Heroes of Light. But this decision left Square Enix in a bit of a pickle. Due to how lucrative the Final Fantasy III and IV remakes had been, they still wanted to further capitalize by producing remakes of Final Fantasy V and VI, but they now lacked a suitable partner to do the work. According to Shinji Hashimoto, they did explore creating the games with a new partner, but after they encountered technical issues, the projects ended up being delayed and then quietly cancelled. And now, some 30 years later, we are still yet to see any form of remake for Final Fantasy V or VI. In lieu of a proper remake, Square Enix instead chose to focus their efforts on attempting to modernise the original version of Final Fantasy VI, and their attempt came to market in 2014. This new version was developed from scratch for iOS and Android devices, and it featured quite a few changes that were meant to further enhance the project. New character sprites were designed, and everything about the visuals were made higher resolution. The version also added achievements, auto-battle functionality, and 8-way movement, allowing characters to walk diagonally. Some of these changes were welcome, but there was a general vibe of negativity around this particular port, especially when it launched on PC at a later date, as some aspects of the visuals just didn't look good in comparison to the original. And it was perhaps for this reason that this version of Final Fantasy VI ended up being phased out in favour of promoting the version that appeared as part of the Pixel Remaster collection. In the middle of 2021, Square Enix announced that they were creating new versions of the 8-bit and 16-bit era games to ensure they all had the same consistent identity. This saw changes made to graphics and sound, but there was a strong promise that all other aspects of the game were to remain faithful to their original launches. This meant that all bonus content introduced throughout the PlayStation, WonderSwan, Game Boy Advance, and smartphone eras was to be removed, and this related to FMV sequences, additional bonus dungeons, and also super bosses. The challenge was that despite their claims about everything remaining faithful, this was only true until it wasn't. For example, they introduced a whole new HD 2D sequence for the opera scene, which was pretty incredible, but they also adopted a host of quality of life changes that affected gameplay. For example, the battle speed option within the menu had its functionality changed, and stats for every character were capped. They also gave prompts to Sabin's Blitz command, as opposed to requiring players to just know the combinations, and adjusted how Cyan's Bushido worked. Further adjustments were then made when the Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster launched on home consoles, such as the ability to adjust EXP gains, disable random encounters, and fixing the font that plagued the original release. Each revision has created different sentiments and preferences, but one common thread has been retained. Over time, Final Fantasy VI has stood out against its 8-bit and 16-bit contemporaries. When placed within that group, it's often the best regarded, and this was all thanks to the initial, brash and bold objective of not just making a good role-playing game, but making a great game that was able to stand out against its peers then and in the future, irrespective of the genre. Final Fantasy VI delivered on this objective on almost every front. It featured a memorable cast of characters, each with their own unique and interesting story sequences, intriguing and innovative gameplay systems, some of which were either adapted or became staples moving forward, and a soundtrack that pushed what people felt was even possible within a video game through its diversity and also its adaptability through tracks like Dancing Mad. It was through these elements and the compounded notion of improvement through quick, high-quality releases that Final Fantasy managed to close the gap on its closest competitor, Dragon Quest. And as thoughts moved into the future, Final Fantasy continued to look forward, hoping to reach even greater heights. Thank you all so much for watching, everyone. My name is Daryl, and this has been the complete history of Final Fantasy VI. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing, and editing this video by giving it a like. In truth, all interactions you make really help the channel out. So if you do genuinely appreciate what we produce, please do let us know. We're also very grateful for the support we receive on Patreon and YouTube memberships. At the beginning of the year, I was unfortunately made redundant, and support from people on Patreon and YouTube memberships has been incredible, and it's really helped to make things a lot more sustainable financially. If you love this kind of content and are excited to see us dive into the PlayStation era, then we'd very much appreciate any support you can offer in helping us with the production of these videos. You can help fund the channel for as little as $3 per month, which gives you access to videos early, ad-free, and audio versions of long-form content like this. We've also brought back the podcast, which is exclusive to Patreon supporters. The likes of Benjamin Snow, Christopher Gardner, Cody Keith, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory, Nate Hancock, and Suiton TDK, who are super special Onion supporters, exemplify this notion. But we are incredibly grateful to all of you, and without your kind support, this channel will be very hard to maintain. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.